Hello, my name is Rachel Ryan, and this is my presentation on moral reasoning and moral behaviors in the prefrontal cortex. This is just a brief overview of the topics I will be covering. First, we are going to be covering what is moral reasoning, and as well as what is the prefrontal cortex. We will also be looking at what happens in the case of damage to the prefrontal cortex, specifically through the case of Vladimir, and then we will finish off with what are moral dilemmas and just some final thoughts. This is just a fun little graphic of the brain. I couldn't find one specifically showing the prefrontal cortex, but we will be focused specifically on the medial and dorsolateral regions of the prefrontal cortex primarily, and also associated regions like the amygdala and the insula, which also have large roles in moral reasoning. I just wanted to quickly touch on some operative definitions for moral reasoning and moral behaviors, which do go hand in hand. Reasoning is a general cognitive process of determination and decision-making, and moral reasoning is how we compare our behaviors and the behaviors of others with understanding of pre-established moral values within a society. So moral behaviors are similar, but are more action or behaviorally focused, which is also shared with the social group. The research perspectives, especially the evolutionary perspectives from more known figures like Darwin, can help us understand how conceptualizations of moral reasoning and moral behaviors have evolved over time and help support research now. To just expand on research perspectives, the recent perspective of moral reasoning is obviously more reflective of current research understandings, and the classical or evolutionary perspectives are older and demonstrate the historical evolution of our understandings. The classical perspective is a more rational, deliberate, and high cognition process. The recent perspective holds that moral reasoning is a more intuitive and effective or emotional process. Within the evolutionary perspectives, Darwin believed that morality is more of a mechanism for social cohesion, and Piaget's theory understands morality from its interaction with the environment. Of course, there are other perspectives in the fields of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and cognitivism, and more. These perspectives are interesting because in the classical or evolutionary perspectives, you can see how different evolutionary theories and perspectives have been integrated into the recent perspective, especially where Darwin's theory believed that morality was more of a basic mechanism for social cohesion, and we can understand morality from its interaction with the environment. We can see that in the recent perspective as it's seen as a more effective or emotional process, which is almost more base in human form. Next, to just kind of answer our question and give us a base of what is the prefrontal cortex, you will notice a fun video of a conductor or conductor hands, which I added to describe the prefrontal cortex and its roles. So the location of the prefrontal cortex is within the frontal lobes of both hemispheres, towards the most frontal region of the frontal lobes, for lack of better words. This is made up of multiple different structures. For moral reasoning, though, we will primarily focus on the medial and dorsolateral regions. And while it's not part of the prefrontal cortex, we will also examine parts of the limbic system, which is like our emotional processing system. The prefrontal cortex has numerous important functions. This can include moral reasoning, obviously, working memory, decision-making, and much more. Generally, the prefrontal cortex just has very large roles in, for lack of better words, conducting or organizing other areas of the brain. As we have established, the prefrontal cortex has many, many valuable functions in daily life and in relation to other cortical structures. As you can imagine, damage to these areas can have profound implications, particularly in the medial and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and moral reasoning. We will look at a specific case of a student named Vladimir, and he'll give a good example of what happens to damage in the dorsolateral region of the prefrontal cortex. But generally, it's good to understand that damage can lead to higher levels of aggression and a lack of concern for social norms. With these findings, which have been supported in numerous research, that these regions are integral neural correlates for moral behaviors. Further research into childhood lesions or damage in childhood to the brain, this suggests that damage during development can have severe consequences for later moral behaviors as well. All right, on to the promised story of Vladimir. Just a brief overview. Vladimir was a very promising and motivated student who did end up suffering a very intense brain injury following a train accident where he was hit by the train. Goldberg, who was working with his mentor at the time, Alexander Romanovich Luria, was assigned to Vladimir. As a result of his injury, he underwent a surgery on both frontal poles, which is just the frontalmost version of the prefrontal cortex. Vladimir lacked the ability following this surgery to start behaviors unless a full physical prompt was used, and also lacked the ability to stop them, which is called inertia of termination. So, for example, a full physical prompt was used, which is hand-on-hand guidance, where Vladimir was asked to draw circles. You would give him the writing utensil and then put your hand over his and start drawing circles with him. If you asked him to stop, though, he was completely unable to terminate that behavior and would continue writing circles until the utensil was removed. So Vladimir's case is a specific example of dorsolateral syndrome, which is also referred to as pseudodepression. This is due to a general inertia and lack of motivation. However, dorsolateral syndrome differs from depression because of its flat affect, and depression obviously has much more of a depressed affect. But Vladimir was also noted to be extremely explosive, which was an uncharacter for him. He could go off truly whenever. He was very much a, for lack of better words, ticking time bomb. I just want to provide a quick overview of moral dilemmas. This will make more sense in the next slide when we talk about a specific study. But generally, moral dilemmas are supposed to help activate moral emotions, and non-moral dilemmas do not. A moral dilemma is a situation where a person faces a conflict between two or more opposing moral values or requirements. A non-moral dilemma is a dilemma with no moral connotation. So in Green et al., which is a 2001 study, and this is Italian, so I apologize if I butcher it, but Ciaramelli et al., which is a 2007 study, researchers used two different types of moral dilemmas, which were personal and impersonal dilemmas. A personal dilemma involves three different elements: 1, causing serious bodily harm; 2, to the human being; and 3, directly through yourself. A moral dilemma has a higher emotional impact due to this. An example would include deciding to push someone into train tracks, which would result in their death, in order to save 5 others. An impersonal dilemma differs from a personal dilemma in that it does not meet at least one of those 3 criteria. This can make the dilemma less intense and allow for quicker decisions to be made for these situations. So, to go more in depth about that study, Ciaramelli et al. 2007, which is a replication of the Green et al. 2001 that we mentioned, researchers presented participants in 2 groups, which was a healthy brain control group and a group with prefrontal cortex damage, personal, impersonal, moral, and non-moral dilemmas. The general objective here was to determine if prefrontal cortex damage had any type of impact on moral reasoning. So participants were shown 45 dilemmas, like the footbridge or trolley dilemma, like we already talked about, and asked to mark whether the action in the dilemma was appropriate or inappropriate. The results indicated that generally both groups are slower and less likely to approve violations in moral dilemmas. As for response times, the control group generally was slower to mark appropriate in personal moral judgments and quicker in impersonal moral judgments. The prefrontal cortex group, though, the damaged group, had approximately equal response times in both personal and impersonal moral judgments. The control group tended to approve fewer personal moral judgments overall, whereas the prefrontal cortex damage group comparatively approved more. Overall, the results indicated that participants with brain damage were faster and more willing than healthy controls to approve moral personal violations, and the performance generally was similar in the impersonal moral dilemmas between both groups. All right, just to quickly wrap this up, we discussed moral reasoning and moral behaviors and the prefrontal cortex and its roles within the brain in relation to moral reasoning. We discussed damage in the prefrontal cortex and how it can have profound implications on moral reasoning and many other areas of the brain, which we did see in Vladimir's case. Moral dilemmas, also we discussed, are a strong way for research to be able to measure moral reasoning. Here are my references, and thank you. If you have any questions, please let me know.